Welcome to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we would be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. And now let's move on to our first story. Maxim Strelnikov always started his day the same way. The alarm went off at 7 o'clock, and feeling tired, he slowly crawled out of his warm bed. Routine actions: a shower, a cup of strong coffee, a quickly packed lunch in a plastic container became part of his life. There was nothing special about it, but Maxim was fine with it. He didn't like it when something went beyond the usual scenario. He valued predictability and order. Maxim worked for a large advertising company in the city center. His position as a senior sales manager provided a stable salary, enough to feel comfortable. He easily communicated with clients, built relationships with partners, and received well-deserved bonuses for fulfilling the plan. Everything related to work seemed simple to him, but the people outside the office, that was a completely different story. Maxim was a man who had difficulty accepting diversity. He believed that the world was divided into us and them. The presence of the others irritated him. They disturbed his sense of the right world. His views were formed over the years, under the influence of his environment and his own experiences. He was convinced that those who were not like him, be it in race, nationality, or lifestyle, did not deserve his respect. For Maxim, this was an axiom. Arriving at the office in his old but reliable sedan, Maxim sighed wearily as he walked up to his floor. Employees had already begun filling their workstations, quietly chatting about projects and news. His colleagues were just like him, young, ambitious, college-educated, eager to climb the career ladder. "Hi, Max," Dima shouted from the next department. Waving his hand, Maxim responded sluggishly, without slowing down. His mood in the morning was surprisingly even. Everything was going according to plan. Sitting down at his desk, he opened his laptop, quickly scanning his emails. Tasks that needed to be solved appeared one after another, but it all seemed familiar, and, by and large, boring. His boss, Igor Vladimirovich, was on vacation, and the next few weeks promised to be calm and relaxed. Maxim liked such moments when he could relax and not strain himself. He looked at his watch and decided to take a short break to go outside for some fresh air. He always liked to walk at this hour. There were few people and you could walk calmly without bumping into random passers-by. Maxim was sure that this day would be the same as all the previous ones. Quiet, routine, with some unpleasant little things, but overall quite tolerable. He didn't even suspect that in a few hours his life would change, and his ideas about the world would be shaken to the core. Maxim pulled on his gray coat, threw on a scarf, and walked out of the building. The cold morning air refreshed his thoughts, and he headed along his usual route to the nearest kiosk to buy coffee. The streets were still half empty. The city was just beginning to wake up, and this was the moment that Maxim liked the most. No one was pushing, no noise, no one was blocking the way. Everything was going according to his schedule. Along the sidewalk walked a motley assortment of passers-by. Some were hurrying to work, some were strolling slowly, enjoying the morning silence. Maxim, as usual, did not pay much attention to them. He always felt a little higher, standing on his personal step of life. Everyone around him seemed faceless, uninteresting, and not worth special attention. Stopping at the kiosk, Maxim ordered his usual cappuccino, took out his phone and started checking social networks. His gaze mechanically slid over the photos of colleagues and old acquaintances. Like after like, empty comments. Everything is standard. As soon as he got his coffee and was about to return to the office, his attention was drawn to a passerby. It was a tall black man in a formal suit, walking along the sidewalk towards him. The man's appearance contrasted with his surroundings. He looked very confident, although he held himself calmly and with dignity. However, for Maxim, there was one element in this picture that spoiled everything. Prejudice thoughts immediately flashed in his head. In such situations, his beliefs always came to the fore. Maxim frowned. Suddenly irritation flared up inside him. For some reason, this particular man made him displeased, even without any reason. The racist prejudices that had been cultivated for years immediately made themselves known. It was as if he felt morally superior. "I wonder where he got such a suit," Maxim muttered under his breath, starting to fidget with the lid of his coffee cup. Did he really buy it at the market? The passerby came closer, and Maxim suddenly felt the desire to tease him, to spoil the mood. As usual, his tongue outpaced common sense. "Hey, "Buddy, the suit is cool. Where did you buy it? On sale?" he shouted with a sarcastic grin. The man paused for a second, looked at Maxim with a calm gaze, in which there was not a shadow of surprise or anger. He glanced at him, as if assessing the situation, but did not answer. He simply turned and calmly went on about his business. Maxim felt a surge of self-satisfaction. He hadn't expected the man to remain silent, and that seemed like a victory to him. In his eyes, this man had no right to feel so confident in this city. That's how it should be, Maxim thought. He's in his place. He finished his coffee, threw the glass in the trash, and headed back to the office, pleased with his wit. When he returned to his desk, his spirits were high. Today promised to be a great day. No unexpected tasks, no bosses, no stress, but little did he know that this morning meeting would be the beginning of the biggest turnaround in his life. Maxim returned to the office feeling slightly euphoric after successfully putting down a stranger on the street. Sitting down at his desk, he leaned back in his chair for a moment, smiling to himself. It was his game to stay on top of the food chain, even if it was within his own world. He disliked people who, in his opinion, didn't fit into the picture of life he was used to. People of other races, especially black people, he always perceived through the prism of his stereotypes. As a child, he rarely encountered those who were not like him, but as he grew older and after watching the news and talking with friends, his beliefs gradually became cemented. Maxim believed that black people were always trying to meddle in other people's affairs. It seemed to him that they were trying to lay claim to places that, in his opinion, did not belong to them, especially in a city like this, where the elite looked completely different. For him, this was a world where everyone had to stay in their place. In his head, there was a clear order. If someone black wore an expensive suit or held a prestigious position, then it was either an accident or a deception. Otherwise, how could it be explained? Maxim didn't think about where these thoughts came from. For him, they were obvious, almost instinctive. As a sales manager, he worked with clients, among whom were sometimes people of a different race. Although on a professional level he tried to be polite, there was always a feeling that he looked down on them. He could smile and joke, but inside there was a cold indifference, mixed with barely noticeable contempt. What do they know about our world? He often thought when he saw another black businessman at negotiations. It seemed to Maxim that such people were simply lucky to be in the right place at the right time. He did not believe in their abilities or skills, privileges. The thought mockingly popped into his head. Such thoughts always found support in his circle. In conversations with friends at parties or during corporate lunches, Maxim often spoke out about racial issues, making caustic remarks and telling joking stories. His colleagues laughed. No one really objected. They grew up in similar conditions and perceived the world in the same way. In such moments, he felt comfortable, knowing that his views were shared by those around him. Lately, however, Maxim had sometimes been bothered by the talk of tolerance and equality that was increasingly appearing in the news and on social media platforms. He felt like the world was moving in the wrong direction. All these rights movements, activists, and changes were simply attempts to change the order of things that had always existed. From his point of view, there was no need for these changes. Why did everyone suddenly decide that people should be equal? He didn't see himself as a problem. It was obvious to him that his beliefs were just common sense, based on life experience. If he achieved anything, it was due to his own work, skills and persistence, but other people's successes always made him suspicious. Maxim plunged back into work, the usual calls, emails, and meetings with clients. Everything was going according to the usual schedule, but every now and then, that black man in a suit would pop into his head. His calm and confidence irritated Maxim, although he couldn't explain why. There was something about this passerby that didn't fit into the picture he had created for himself. Almost without noticing how the hours passed, Maxim continued to work, convinced that everything in his life was under control. But while he thought that this day would be another chapter in his perfect world, fate was already preparing an unexpected turn for him. Maxim was completely immersed in his work, not suspecting that soon his views would collide with a reality that would turn all his ideas upside down. His thoughts about the world were habitual, as if built into his daily thoughts. On autopilot, he switched between tasks, taking calls, answering emails, planning the next meetings with clients. Everything that did not concern his professional zone seemed insignificant, as if it existed in another world. He had long considered himself a successful person who had no need to listen to the opinions of others. His views on life were formed in a narrow circle of his family, friends and colleagues, among whom he never encountered real criticism of his beliefs. Everyone around him spoke the same language, the language of stereotypes and unspoken prejudices. At one point, his attention was distracted by a conversation in the general office chat. One of the employees sent a link to an article about corporate responsibility and equal opportunities in the workplace. Someone started discussing diversity and tolerance, and Maxim couldn't help but snort. Glancing at the screen, these topics always irritated him. He believed that they were imposed from above, that all this talk about racial equality was nothing more than a fashion that would soon pass. Again about this tolerance, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Nothing good will come of it. He closed the chat window and went back to his business. It all seemed like a waste of time to him. No matter what anyone said, people would always remain who they were, and no amount of talk about change would fix that. However, thoughts about his recent encounter with a dark-skinned man on the street did not give him peace. Why did it bother him so much? Maxim tried to convince himself that nothing special had happened, just another person who did not fit into his ideal world. But for some reason, every time he remembered his calm look, his irritation only increased. A few hours passed, and the day was drawing to a close. Work was going on as usual, but Maxim's mood was gradually deteriorating. He opened social networks to distract himself and came across another post about the Black rights movement. With each new headline, his anger only grew. They're everywhere with their agenda, he thought, as if we don't have other problems. Closing his laptop with a sharp bang, Maxim felt his patience running out. All this talk of equality seemed not only pointless to him, but also threatening to his usual way of life. It seemed to him that the world around him was changing too quickly, and he did not like it. But he didn't yet know that change was already knocking at his door. As he was about to leave for home, a notification appeared on his computer screen. It was an urgent message from the HR department, addressed to all office employees. The text said that an important meeting with the new CEO of the company would take place the following day. Maxim didn't even know that the old CEO had been fired. There had been rumors about a change in management in the company for a long time, but nothing concrete had been known until today. I wonder who it will be, Maxim muttered, feeling a slight curiosity that quickly gave way to indifference. Some bore with a bunch of new ideas, for sure. He closed the message and stood up, preparing to leave the office. Tomorrow promised to be a normal day, but a little unusual because of the meeting with the new manager. Another day in a series of the same workdays. However, Maxim could not imagine that at this meeting he would encounter not only the new director, but also himself. The next morning, on his way to work, Maxim again passed the same kiosk where he always bought coffee. The morning rhythms of the city once again filled the air with sounds, car horns, conversations of passers-by and the sound of footsteps. He paused for a second to catch a glance at the local news, when his attention was again drawn to a black man who had just come out of one of the neighboring buildings. This time the man was dressed more casually, a black jacket, jeans and sneakers. He seemed to be busy checking his phone and, not noticing anyone around him, walked towards the bus stop. Maxim felt the prejudiced feeling boiling up inside him again. Here he is, on the street again. Don't they understand that they have to dress appropriately for work? Flashed through his mind. He noticed how the man easily walked past other people, and this confidence frankly angered him. He probably doesn't know what work is, and yet he walks around here like a king. As Maxim stood to the side, waiting in line for coffee, he noticed the man suddenly stop and turn to him. The sudden face-to-face encounter excited Maxim, and he felt his heart beat faster. He didn't know what to say. This man was the same one he had humiliated the day before, but now he looked as if he wasn't paying attention to him. At that moment, Maxim realized that their eyes met. The passerby raised his eyebrows, as if trying to recognize something familiar in his face. Feelings flared up inside Maxim: confusion, anger, and some strange feeling of guilt. He had not expected that this man would be here again, and, even more so, he could not imagine that they would be in such a close space. What? Maybe he needs to say something, thought Maxim, realizing that his usual wit was just a mask behind which his real insecurity was hidden. Feeling panic creeping up on him, he tried to project his confidence onto the man. "Hey, you!" he shouted, trying to show that he was still in control of the situation. "Watch how you dress if you want to impress." The passerby stopped and laughed quite simply in response. His laugh was calm and confident, as if he was simply enjoying the situation. "I wasn't trying to impress," he replied calmly, his voice filled with lightness and serenity. "I'm just rushing to work." Maxim, feeling uneasy, continued to look at the man, but the words were stuck in his throat. Something about his tone and demeanor made him feel uneasy. He expected the man to react aggressively or defensively, but instead he remained confident and poised. "Well, yeah, you know what real work looks like," Maxim blurted out, trying to take control of the conversation again. "Don't forget that if you want to achieve something, you have to look the part." The passerby just shook his head, but now a slight look of bewilderment appeared on his face. "Perhaps, but it's worth remembering that appearance is not the most important thing. What matters is what you do and how you behave," he said, turning around and continuing his way to the bus. These words caused an internal conflict in Maxim. He expected that he would have the opportunity to poke and humiliate the passerby, but instead he was left confused. All his racist prejudices and contemptuous thoughts, which once seemed simple and understandable to him, suddenly began to crumble before his eyes. Maxim stood at the kiosk, feeling his anger begin to give way to uncertainty. He didn't know what to do next. His familiar world, where he could easily judge others, was beginning to crumble, and more importantly, he still didn't understand that the person he was humiliating was his new director. For a moment, everything around him went dark and his thoughts began to spin. This was an encounter that would leave a mark on his life, and he had no idea how radically his usual views of people and himself would change. Maxim stood there, confused, his thoughts in a tangle. He watched the man quickly cross the street and then disappear around the corner. An unpleasant feeling of unease pierced him, and he felt as if his own convictions had been cruelly tested. Something inside him cracked, and he could not understand why he had been so affected by the encounter with this man. All the way to the office, his mind was occupied with only one question: who is this man? Why is he acting so confident? And why hasn't he managed to humiliate him? Maxim felt that perhaps for the first time in his life he had encountered someone who didn't let him get the better of him. When he finally got to the office, the atmosphere inside could be described in one word: tension. Colleagues were whispering, and there was a slight wave of anticipation in the air. Maxim sat down at his desk and turned on his computer, but his thoughts were still somewhere outside. He kept glancing at his watch, waiting for the meeting with the new CEO to take place. He felt uneasy at the thought that the black man who could humiliate him could be his new boss. Maxim stood up again, went to the window and looked out. The gray sky and the passers-by who were hurrying about their business could not distract him from these thoughts. He again remembered the confidence of the man and his words about the importance of actions, not appearance. He was unexpectedly interrupted by his colleague Olga, who approached his desk. "Max, have you heard who our new director is going to be?" she asked, winking. Maxim quickly straightened up, trying to hide his confusion. "No, who?" he answered, although deep down he already guessed. "They say it's some successful businessman from a large corporation," she continued. "That should be interesting." At that moment, he felt his heart pounding, as if his premonitions were coming true. He began to be tormented by doubts. What if this is the man? Pierced his consciousness. He could not allow this. How could he work under the leadership of a man he had insulted on the street? Soon there was a noise behind the door, and several people entered the office, including an HR representative. Maxim took a closer look, and his fears were confirmed. Among the new employees was the same black man in a suit. He looked confident, held himself with dignity, and immediately attracted everyone's attention. "Congratulations, colleagues," the HR representative said loudly when the new director entered the room. "Let me introduce our new CEO, Damir Sadikov." Maxim felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He couldn't believe that his prejudices had collided with reality so abruptly and cruelly. Thoughts of how he had humiliated this man, not knowing that he would be his new boss, were spinning in his head. Soon Damir's voice was heard, giving a welcoming speech. "I am glad to welcome you to the team, and I am sure that together we can achieve great success," Damir said, smiling. His voice was calm and confident, but there was not a trace of arrogance in it. Maxim felt trapped. His anxiety was growing with each passing minute. He understood that now he would have to face not only the new management, but also himself. His usual views and beliefs began to crack at the seams, like an old house that was suddenly threatened with destruction. From the moment Damir Sadikov walked into the office, the atmosphere changed. Excitement and anticipation hung in the air as all eyes were on the new director. Maxim tried not to panic. but the realization that he had humiliated his boss weighed on him like a heavy stone. Demir spoke confidently to the team, talking about his plans and vision for the company's future. His speech was filled with enthusiasm and determination, and gradually the tension in the office began to subside. But for Maxim, it all looked like a nightmare. He could not distract himself from his fears that his previous biases would now cost him his career. After the presentation, the staff began asking questions, and the atmosphere eased. Maxim, realizing that this was his only chance to regain some self-confidence, took a step forward. "I have a question," he said, trying to sound confident. "You talk about diversity, but what about the fact that some people are just not ready to work in our team, no matter how hard they try? For example, have you had any difficulties adapting?" The question sounded harsh, and his colleagues froze. Turning to look at him, Demir raised an eyebrow for just a moment, but quickly regained his composure. "Anyone can have difficulties," he replied, looking straight into Maxim's eyes, "but that's no reason to be biased. What's important is how a person treats their work and their team. Appearance doesn't determine ability." Maxim felt his blood boil. He didn't want to stop, because this conversation had become an opportunity for him to vent his anger. "You know, when I see people who can't adapt," he continued, "I think they just don't understand how our world works. Like, if you look like you, maybe you should think about how other people treat you." There was a moment of silence in the room. Demir just looked at Maxim, and in his gaze Maxim caught something more than just bewilderment. He felt his heart beat faster from a combination of fear and anger. "I understand what you're trying to say, but remember that every opinion is based on experience, and you shouldn't generalize. Sometimes people just don't have a chance, and it's not their fault," Demir said, his voice calm but slightly reproachful. "But that's their choice," Maxim stubbornly objected, not even noticing that his words were beginning to go beyond the bounds of reason. "When I see someone failing to meet the standards, it's simply bewildering. How can they expect respect if they themselves do nothing for it?" The discussion was turning into an open conflict, and other employees began to whisper among themselves, assessing the situation. Some of them began to raise their hands to ask questions, but the atmosphere was already tense. "You talk about standards, but you forget that every story is unique," Demir said again, and there was already a sense of firmness in his voice. "I know what it's like when people around you look at you with bias. It's important to understand that respect is not something you receive, but something you give to others." Maxim felt his words cut off his self-confidence. He had not expected the new director to resist his pressure so steadfastly. Realizing that his words were not producing the expected effect, he bit his lip even harder. "It's hard to understand when you're not in someone else's shoes," Demir said, his eyes shining as he seemed to get to the heart of things. "We're all different, but that doesn't make any of us worse. I believe in everyone's potential, no matter what they look like." As Demir spoke, Maxim felt his anger begin to fade, giving way to confusion. He didn't know how to respond to the words of the man he was trying to humiliate, and with each sentence he spoke, he felt his own prejudices begin to crack at the seams. This verbal attack, which he had launched with the intention of elevating himself, had only served to undermine his authority. He realized that he had perhaps not only insulted the new director, but had also become a victim of his own limitations. When the discussion came to an end and the team began to disperse, Maxim remained standing in the center of the room, feeling the ground slipping away from under his feet. Demir, concluding the meeting, turned to him and said, "I hope we can work together to change this office for the better, but to do that, we need to leave our prejudices behind." At these moments, Maxim felt that he had encountered not only a new director, but also a reflection of himself, and perhaps in this reflection he needed to see something more than just external differences. After Maxim had let go of his insults, Demir stood before him with unwavering calm, and at that moment the atmosphere in the office turned into something much more tense than before. Colleagues exchanged glances. Some whispered, others clearly wondered how this was possible in modern society. However, Demir did not look shocked or scared. On the contrary, he maintained confidence and dignity, which seemed to only emphasize his position. "You know, Max," he said, turning to him, "I'm sorry to hear you say that. I expected more from a colleague, but this only shows how important it is for all of us to continue to work on ourselves and learn to be more open." Maxim didn't know how to react to this. Instead of the expected reaction of anger or aggression, Demir demonstrated confidence that even open provocation could not undermine. There was neither hatred nor aggression in him, only calm, which became a blow below the belt for Maxim. "I'm not going to justify my words," Demir continued. "I just know how important it is to maintain a dialogue, even when it gets difficult. It's important not only for us, but for the whole team." With each word, Maxim felt his own prejudices begin to crumble. He had not expected that his provocation could be received with such wisdom and tolerance. Demir did not simply ignore his insults, he responded to them like a man who truly knew his worth. "You have the opportunity to be better, Max," Demir said, and there was sincerity in his voice. "I believe that you can do it, but to do this, you need to leave behind unnecessary stereotypes and start seeing people as they are, and not through the prism of bias." Maxim felt his inner barriers begin to crumble. He remembered that moment on the street when he had humiliated Demir. Not knowing his true role, he was now standing in front of a man who, instead of malice, responded with kindness and understanding. At this time, colleagues began to slowly disperse, but tension was still in the air. Some, noticing how Demir was not giving in to provocations, began to express support. "You're right, Demir," one of the employees said. "These things can't be ignored. Each of us can make a mistake, and we need to learn from our mistakes." Maxim felt shame wash over him. He didn't want to be the center of attention any longer, but his inner voice, always ready to judge, now seemed oppressed. He began to realize that all his hatred was not simply aimed at others, but a reflection of his own insecurities and fears. "I'm sorry, Demir," he said, and there was a sincerity in his voice that surprised him. "I didn't mean to. I had no right to say that. I understand that it was wrong." Demir looked at him, and in his eyes there was no hatred or anger, only understanding. "We all make mistakes," he replied calmly, "but the important thing is to learn from them and move forward. I hope you can see that." Demir's words made an impression on Maxim. He felt his prejudices slowly subsiding, and questions were taking their place. Why was he always so dissatisfied? Why was he afraid of people who looked different? When the last of his colleagues left the room and it was just the two of them, Maxim felt the need to talk to Demir alone. He wanted to understand how he was able to maintain confidence in the face of open aggression, and he was ready to learn. "Can we talk?" he asked, trying to sound confident. Demir nodded. "Of course, I am always ready for dialogue." Maxim felt a new opportunity opening up before him. He didn't know where this conversation would lead him, but he was ready to take the first step toward change. The internal dialogue with himself was finally bearing fruit, and he wanted to move on. The morning of his second workday began in a completely different mood for Maxim. After the incident on the street, he felt full of strength and confidence, as if the shadow he had always hidden had finally become part of his being. He left the house thinking about how his words, although harsh, had given him a sense of power, that he had finally been able to prove his point. Maxim walked into the office with a smile on his face and his steps full of confidence. He met the gaze of his colleagues, who were exchanging whispers and nods, as if they were still under the impression of his revelations at the meeting yesterday. He felt on top of the world. He had finally said what he felt needed to be said. "Hello, Max," Olga greeted him as he passed her desk. "How are you today?" "Excellent," he replied, trying to hide his inner satisfaction. "Ready for new achievements?" Olga nodded, but a shadow of bewilderment flashed across her face. Maxim ignored it and headed to his desk. He opened his mail and began checking messages, but his thoughts kept returning to yesterday's incident. Every word he said then seemed right to him. He finally felt in his place, and nothing could change that. While he was leafing through the documents, Demir entered the office. His confidence and calm immediately attracted attention. His colleagues, noticing the new CEO, began to talk, and Maxim felt his inner excitement turn into slight anxiety. He could not shake off the thought that his humiliation could affect their future interactions. Demir walked up to him and their eyes met. "Hey, Max," he said with a slight smile. "Ready for the day?" Maxim, although he tried to hide his confusion, could not restrain himself and answered with self-assertion. "Yes, always ready. I hope we will have a productive day." The same thought as before flashed through his mind again. Why doesn't he feel humiliated? Why is he so calm? Now that they were both in the office, Maxim felt superior. He knew that he had the ability to control the situation. If he could establish his own rules, then Demir would not be able to stop him. "Great, we have a lot of tasks on the agenda, and I am sure that the team will cope. I count on your support," said Demir, clearly not noticing Maxim's internal conflict. "Of course, I'm always ready to help," Maxim said, not even trying to hide his inner anger. Demir nodded and headed towards his room. Maxim watched him go and felt his inner satisfaction rise again. He decided that he had to show who the real leader was in the office, so that no one would doubt his authority. As the day progressed, Maxim began interacting with his colleagues, commenting on various issues and trying to steer the discussions in a direction that would benefit him. He said that the team should work more efficiently and offered his own ideas, trying to undermine Demir's authority. Each time his comments were picked up, he felt more and more confident. However, deep down, something was bothering him. He couldn't get rid of the thought of how Demir was reacting to his words. Maybe he was actually stronger than he thought. Maybe humiliating another person wouldn't make him superior. But Maxim tried to push these thoughts away. After all, he had a chance to prove himself, and he wasn't going to miss it. After lunch, when most of the staff had returned to their places, Demir gathered the team to discuss current projects. Maxim stood up with the others, and when Demir began to speak, all eyes focused on him again. "I hope that we will be able to create an atmosphere of mutual assistance and respect, where everyone can contribute to the company's success," Demir said. "This applies not only to professional skills, but also to human qualities. It is important to support each other, especially in difficult times." Maxim, sitting at the table, grinned. He was not going to listen to empty words about mutual assistance. Plans were already spinning in his head about how to undermine the authority of the new director, how to make everyone see that he, Maxim, was a real leader. He knew that the moment would soon come when he would have to act, but for now he only enjoyed the feeling of power, as if his dislike and insults were the only form of self-expression. Evening light was streaming through the office windows as Maxim was still at his desk, reviewing reports. His thoughts kept returning to the day he had humiliated Demir on the street, and although he tried not to pay attention to it, deep down, fear was brewing. He couldn't shake the feeling that his words could have consequences. Suddenly, there was the sound of footsteps in the corridor, and Olga walked into their office with a serious face. She was one of the senior employees and was always distinguished by her restraint. At that moment, all eyes turned to her. "We have important news," she said, and there was excitement in her voice. "There is a new director in the office now, and he wants to have a meeting with us." Maxim froze, his heart beating faster. What the hell flashed through his mind. He quickly glanced at his colleagues, and his expression instantly changed. Olga continued, "We all know that changes are happening to the company with Demir's arrival, but it seems he was appointed for something bigger. The new director is already here and expects us to gather in 10 minutes. A sense of unease filled the office. Maxim felt his forehead sweating and his knees shaking slightly. Deep down, he knew this might not be just a meeting, it might be an opportunity for the new director to give him, or, on the contrary, a way to expose his biases. "Who was appointed?" someone asked from afar, but Olga only shrugged. "I don't know, but it seems serious to me," she replied. Maxim felt anxiety swirl in his stomach. "What if this is that Demir?" he thought. "What if he gets called to court for insulting me?" He began running through possible scenarios in his head. He had to be prepared. Soon the staff began to gather in the conference room, and despite all his confidence, the inner fear and tension still remained with him. He took a deep breath to calm himself and followed the others. When everyone had gathered, the tension in the air was palpable. Maxim sat down in the front row, trying to look at the new director's face when he walked in. A man in a formal suit walked through the door, with a confident posture and a penetrating gaze. His silver hair emphasized his age, and his facial expression betrayed experience and determination. "Good afternoon, colleagues," he said, looking around the audience. "My name is Oleg Kotov, and I am glad to welcome you to our office. I will be your new director, and I am sure that together we can achieve great results." Maxim involuntarily tensed up. The word "new director" kept ringing in his head. He didn't know what approach Oleg would take, but he knew he'd have to be prepared. "I value each of you and believe that teamwork is the foundation of our success," Oleg continued, his voice sounding confident and friendly. "It is important that everyone feels part of the team, and I hope for openness in our relations." Oleg began to talk about his plans and vision for the company. Maxim listened, but his thoughts continued to wander. He could not concentrate, constantly returning to recent events. How would the new director react to his behavior? What if he found out that he had insulted Demir? Meanwhile, Oleg began asking questions of the staff about current projects and their opinions. Maxim, who was about to interject his comments, felt his confidence begin to wane. He barely restrained himself from hiding behind a column. But then, when his gaze crossed with Oleg, he realized that he couldn't just disappear. Max, what do you think about this project? The new director suddenly turned to him. All eyes turned to him. Maxim froze. I think we should consider additional resources to achieve better results, he said, trying to sound confident. The team can do more if there is enough support. That's a very good comment, Oleg said, and his gaze seemed to penetrate into Maxim's very essence. I'm always for the team to feel supported and able to grow. After the discussion, the meeting gradually came to an end, but Maxim felt his inner fear continue to oppress him. Oleg listened to him. But what next? What impact would it have on his career if the new director learned of his bias and rudeness? Leaving the conference room, Maxim found himself alone in the corridor. He was trying to collect his thoughts when Demir's voice was heard behind him. Max, could you come over here for a minute? Maxim froze. His heart began to pound. This could be the moment when he would have to answer for his words. But there was no turning back. Yes, of course, he answered, turning around. Demir's gaze was full of determination, and Maxim felt that now his life could change forever. Maxim took a deep breath, trying to suppress the growing excitement. He slowly turned and stepped toward the door where Demir was waiting. Each of his steps sounded in the silence of the corridor like the striking of a bell. He did not know what awaited him, but internal fear was an integral part of the upcoming meeting. When Maxim entered the office, Demir was standing next to the new director Oleg. Both figures personified strength and confidence, but for Maxim, these were two poles of his internal conflict. As soon as he approached, Oleg turned around and their eyes met. At that moment, everything around him seemed to freeze. Maxim couldn't believe his eyes. Standing before him was the very man he had humiliated on the street. Oleg was that black passerby. Now it wasn't just humiliation, it was his new director. Hello, Max, Oleg said, his voice confident and friendly, but Maxim caught a hint of sincerity in it. I'm glad to see you in our office. Maxim froze, his mind trying to process the information, but the words were stuck in his throat. He felt his hands grow cold, and a chill ran down his spine. Hello, he said, trying to maintain his composure. A hurricane of emotions raged inside him, shame, anger, fear, and bewilderment all at once. How could this have happened? How could he have so stupidly insulted the man who was now his boss? Demir, how are you? Oleg asked, ignoring the tension in the air and addressing Demir with warmth. Maxim watched their interaction, unable to utter a word. He suddenly realized that his life now depended on how Oleg would react to his behavior. I'm fine, Demir replied, his voice sounding confident. I'd like to introduce Maxim, our experienced employee. Nice to meet you, Oleg said, extending his hand. Maxim reluctantly reached out to him. Oleg's touch on his hand was like a lightning strike. There was no anger or contempt in it, only calm and confidence. This confused Maxim even more. How could the man he had humiliated forgive so easily? You know, Max, Oleg continued, his eyes shining with kindness, I believe that we have the opportunity to create something special in this team. I hope that we can work together to achieve great goals. Everything inside Maxim turned upside down. He didn't know how to react. His pride and confidence, which he had so carefully built up, began to crack at the seams. He knew that he had to be honest. He said haltingly. I'm sorry about what happened yesterday. It was wrong of me. Oleg nodded, and understanding appeared on his face. We all make mistakes, Max. It's important to learn from them and grow as professionals and as people. I'm sure you can do it. Maxim felt his shame grow. He couldn't just leave it at that. He had to show that he had really changed, otherwise this whole situation would only be the beginning of his problems. Thank you for listening to me. I hope I can change my behavior and work on myself, he said sincerely. Oleg smiled, and it was a warmth that warmed not only him, but also Maxim. I'm glad to hear it, Max. This is the first step to something bigger. Demir stood between them, watching their exchange, and seemed proud of how everything was turning out. "Let's work together and make our team even stronger," Demir added, steering the conversation in a constructive direction. Maxim nodded, and although his head was still swirling with thoughts, he felt that perhaps he had a chance to change his life and views. He now had a new director who could not only help him professionally, but also witnessed his fall. And though there was much work ahead, he knew that now was the beginning of his journey to redemption. Questions about how he could change himself twinkled like stars in his mind, illuminating the path he must take. After meeting with Oleg, Maxim left the office, but did not feel relief. On the contrary, his soul was filled with deep shame. Each step towards the exit was difficult for him, as if he were dragging a very heavy load behind him. All he could think about were the words he had spoken, humiliating the man who was now his director. His own words echoed in his head, and every time he heard them, an unpleasant feeling rose up inside him. He had hurt Oleg's dignity, and he could not forgive that. How could he do that? How could he be so cruel? Outside, the wind gently ruffled his hair, but Maxim felt neither fresh nor cheerful. Instead, he felt fear permeating every cell of his body. He realized that his behavior could have consequences not only for him, but for the entire team to which he belonged. What if Oleg tells others about this, he thought. What if he files a complaint against me with HR or, even worse, fires me? I can't let that happen. Maxim realized that he had to pull himself together and find a way to atone for his guilt. He walked to his car and got behind the wheel, but his thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. He couldn't concentrate on the road. Every encounter with other motorists felt like a judgmental look, as if the world around him was just waiting for the moment when he would show what kind of person he really was. Returning home, he threw his bag in the corner and collapsed on the sofa. Shame and fear overwhelmed him like clouds gathering before a storm. Maxim began to think of exactly how he could apologize to Oleg, but every time he tried to formulate his thoughts, the words stuck in his throat. Unable to resist his feelings, he took out his phone and opened the messenger, but, hesitating, he could not write a word. His fear of the consequences was too great. He did not know what to do and how to act. He couldn't sleep that night. Many thoughts about how to change his behavior and show his true nature were bubbling in his head. It was important to do this before Oleg decided that he was just another racist who didn't belong on the team. The next day, when Maxim came to the office again, he saw all his colleagues gathered around the new director, who was already holding morning briefings and discussing plans for the future. Maxim, as if lost in the crowd, stood frozen at the entrance, watching Oleg communicate with others. There was something relaxing in his manner, and it became a reminder that the man he was humiliating was not just a director, but a real leader. An enormous sense of guilt overwhelmed him. I can't just let this go, he thought, as fear made him withdraw further into himself. But how could he do that? How could he approach someone who knew he was being biased and ask for forgiveness? Gathering his strength, he approached the common table where his colleagues were standing. Oleg noticed him and smiled. Max, it's good to see you, he said with genuine warmth. How are you? Maxim felt his breath catch. The question sounded so simple, but for him it was a difficult challenge. He knew that he had to answer not just with words, but with sincerity. I need to talk to you, he said, feeling his voice tremble. At that moment, all eyes turned to him. He expected condemnation, but instead he saw support in the eyes of his colleagues. Oleg nodded, and his expression changed to a more serious one. Of course, let's discuss it in my office, he said, and there was a willingness to understand in his voice. Maxim felt hope rise in his chest. This was his chance to change his fate and perhaps redeem himself. He nodded and followed Oleg, feeling his fear begin to recede. But a difficult conversation awaited him ahead. He understood that this meeting was not just a conversation, but an opportunity to change his life and views. Maxim walked down the corridor, his heart pounding as if it was trying to escape from his chest. Oleg's office door was visible on the horizon, and every movement he made seemed heavy and awkward, as if nature itself was trying to stop him, forcing him to think about the consequences. His mind was racing with what he was going to say. He replayed the dialogues over and over again, but he couldn't find the right words. His anxiety grew as he noticed his knees were shaking. How could I have done something so stupid? He kept telling himself as he finally reached the door. Gathering his strength, He knocked. Oleg's deep voice came from behind the door. "Come in." Maxim opened the door and entered the office. Inside, everything looked as he expected, a strict office with several awards on the walls and a large desk, behind which sat the new director. Oleg looked at him with a kind smile, but Maxim noticed that the director's eyes were serious. "Sit down, Max," he said, pointing to the chair opposite. Maxim sat down, feeling his insides tighten. He saw Oleg looking at him intently, and that added to his excitement. "I want to talk about yesterday's meeting and your behavior," Oleg began, his voice sounding calm but insistent. Maxim, collecting his thoughts, took a deep breath. "Yes, I know it was wrong," he said, the words coming out with difficulty. "I regret what I said. It was inappropriate, and I realize I offended you." The moment he said these words, he saw Oleg's eyes soften, but there was still seriousness in them. "I appreciate your candor, Max. We all make mistakes, but it's important that we learn from them," Oleg replied. "However, it's important for me to know that you're ready for change." Maxim felt his throat go dry. He realized that this was not just an apology, but a chance to restore his reputation. "I'm ready. I want to change my behavior and my views," he said, his voice sounding more confident. "I understand that it may take time, but I'm ready for it." Oleg nodded, his gaze becoming even more penetrating. "Okay, I believe you can do it, but keep in mind that I will not tolerate any manifestations of racism or bias in our team. Not only would it be a violation of corporate policy, but it would also harm the entire team." Oleg's words came like a bolt from the blue. Maxim knew it wasn't just a threat, it was a serious warning. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. "I understand that, and that will be my main goal," he replied, trying to sound confident. "I'm glad to hear that," Oleg said, and there was a note of support in his voice. "I also want you to know that I'm here to help you. If you need to talk, or if you feel like you're facing bias again, don't hesitate to reach out to me." Maxim was surprised by Oleg's willingness to support him. "Thank you, this is very important to me," he said, sincerely feeling that now he had a chance. Oleg continued, "I know it can be hard. We've all been through our trials, and this is no exception, but it's through moments like these that we become stronger." Maxim nodded, his shame gradually beginning to recede. He felt that this was a beginning not only for him, but for the whole team. Oleg was ready to accept him as an equal, and this gave him hope. "If you're ready, we have a few team events where you can interact more with other team members and show off your changes," Oleg said, his voice sounding encouraging. "I'm ready for this," Maxim answered, feeling new energy rising within him. Oleg smiled. "Then let's do it. I believe in you, Max." Maxim stood up, and a spark of hope lit in his heart. He left the office with new determination and the understanding that his life was changing. It was just the first step on a long journey, but he was up for the challenge. Maxim left Oleg's office with a sense of relief and hope, but at the same time, the awareness of the responsibility he now bore grew stronger in his heart. Oleg was not just his boss, he had become a symbol of the changes Maxim demanded of himself. The office atmosphere that day was tense but productive. Everyone was working on their own projects, and Maxim knew he needed to demonstrate his willingness to change, but at the same time, he knew he was about to have a conversation that could change not only his life, but also the views of his colleagues. When it was time for lunch, Oleg gathered the team to discuss current projects and upcoming tasks. He spoke confidently to the staff, sharing his vision and motivation. Maxim sat among his colleagues, realizing how his attitude towards all this had changed. He began to perceive Oleg's words not as instructions, but as valuable lessons. "I want us to talk about the importance of diversity and equality," Oleg began, his voice confident. "We live in a world where everyone has the right to be heard, where everyone has the right to be respected." The director's words sounded like a loud reminder. Maxim froze, listening. Oleg continued, "We are all different, but that does not mean that someone is better or worse than another. Each of us is a valuable link in this team, and it is this diversity that makes us stronger." Maxim felt his heart tighten. He remembered all the prejudices that had once been part of his worldview. Every judgmental look, every insult he had uttered now seemed vile to him. "I understand that many of us may have our own biased opinions or stereotypes," Oleg continued, "but it's important to realize that behind each such opinion there is a real person with their own feelings and experiences. Oleg's words had the effect of a cold shower on Maxim. He understood that this lesson in justice concerned not only him, but each of his colleagues. He felt awkward among his friends and partners, realizing how easily they could make the same mistake he did. Oleg, noticing how the group was listening to him, continued, "Each of you faces a choice. Choice is what shapes our society. We can choose to ignore differences, or, conversely, to value them and enrich our lives with new perspectives and experiences." Maxim suddenly realized that Oleg was putting him before an important choice. His own behavior and the way he perceived the people around him were now undermining the foundation of this team. Two feelings were fighting inside him: shame for his past actions and the desire to change himself for the better. "I know that change takes time and effort," Oleg continued, "but I also know that if we work together, we can achieve great results and create an environment where everyone feels comfortable." At that moment, Maxim realized that Oleg wasn't just sharing philosophy, he was offering a real opportunity to change the culture in the office. He had to decide how he wanted to proceed. "I encourage you to think about how you treat others and how this can affect our team," Oleg concluded, looking at everyone present. Having collected his thoughts, Maxim raised his hand. "Oleg," he said, his voice shaking, "I want to say that I understand that I made a mistake. I want to change my views and my behavior, but I understand that these are not just words. I am ready to work on myself and learn." Oleg nodded, and approval appeared in his eyes. "This is the first step, Max. Now you have the opportunity not only to change yourself, but also to become an example for others." At that moment, Maxim felt that he was not alone in his efforts. He was part of a team that could support each other in striving for the best. He had a chance to create a new reality where biases would have no place. "I will do everything I can to be better," he said, full of determination. From that day on, he knew that the road to change would be long, but he was ready to take on this responsibility. Oleg's lesson in justice became the starting point for a new beginning that he could not ignore. Several weeks had passed since the day Maxim met Oleg in his office. Since then, much had changed not only in the office, but also in Maxim himself. Every day, he tried to consciously work on himself, studying not only his thoughts, but also the biases that once ruled his life. He started small, listening carefully to his colleagues, paying attention to their stories, experiences, and feelings. Each conversation opened up new horizons for him. He felt his world expanding, and with each new encounter, his previous views on life were challenged. Oleg, being a patient and understanding director, actively supported changes in the team. He initiated workshops on diversity and inclusion, where everyone could openly discuss their views and biases. Maxim participated in these meetings, and every word spoken by others became a lesson for him. He began to realize that racism and bias were not just personal failings, but social problems that needed to be addressed together. With each passing day, he realized how important it was to become part of the solution, not the problem. In the evening, as he walked home, he often reflected on how his life and his surroundings had changed. He had become more empathetic to people, and his former bitterness had given way to understanding. He no longer allowed his fears and prejudices to determine his behavior. Instead, he sought opportunities to interact with those who had previously been alien to him. One day, during lunch break, Maxim was sitting in a cafe with Oleg and several colleagues. They were discussing projects and ideas, but the conversation suddenly turned to personal experiences and life's difficulties. "You know," began one of my colleagues, "John, I grew up in an environment where I was taught to hate. It was hard, and only over time did I understand how important it is to open up to the world." Listening to him, Maxim remembered his previous beliefs and how they held him back. He remembered the moment when he humiliated Oleg and realized how stupid and cruel it was to judge people based only on their appearance. "It's like at some point you realize that racism isn't just prejudice, it's a lack of knowledge," he said. "I used to think that way myself, but now I see that we all deserve respect, regardless of skin color or cultural background." Oleg, who was sitting next to him, nodded with approval. "Exactly, Max. Openness and willingness to learn are key to change. These are not just words, these are actions that shape our society." Maxim felt pride well up inside him. He realized that he was no longer afraid to talk about his feelings and experiences. He was not perfect, and he knew that it would take time to change, but he was ready for it. After that meeting, He reflected on his role on the team and how he could contribute to a more inclusive environment. He suggested holding informal meetings where employees could share their stories and ideas. With each step he took, Maxim became more confident in himself and his attitude towards others. He understood that the path to redemption and change would not always be easy, but he was ready for it. Maxim smiled as he walked out of the cafe and looked at the people around him. He felt his views had changed, and it filled him with happiness. Each person was a unique story, and now he was ready to listen to them. This new understanding gave him strength and confidence, and he knew that his life would never be the same again. At that moment, he felt that he had finally found his path, a path that led to a more open and respectful world. Maxim was ready to take responsibility and continue to learn, work on himself, and support others on this path. The story of his transformation was just beginning, and he knew that many new discoveries and friendships lay ahead. With this feeling, he stepped forward, ready for the new challenges and opportunities that awaited him in the future. End of story. Thank you for listening. We have many interesting stories on our channel that you can also listen to. Don't get into the same stories and write a comment what you think about this story.